Yeah, you get to sit in here. Oh yeah, that'll be helpful. I don't know why when you first cut that one on, it gets crazy. That one that affects it. Well, good morning. Did anyone not get a handout this morning? Welcome. Well, there's not a whole lot of information on this handout. We're going to cover some other stuff, but kind of some verses there that we covered last week, just so you kind of got them for your notes if you want them, and also some stuff we're going to talk about this morning that I wanted you to be to have in front of you, so that when we change slides, you can reference back to it. So if you weren't here last week, for the next couple months, we're going to be talking about leadership and its various forms and applications, and how that applies specifically to spiritual leadership, and kind of some key takeaways there. You can see the scriptures we looked at last week while we were going through this, and if you remember, without going into too much detail, we went over some definitions, possible definitions of leadership from a secular standpoint that can also apply to spiritual stuff as well. Talking about how one of the specific definitions we looked at was that leadership's the process of encouraging and helping others to work enthusiastically toward objectives or goals. And we'll probably cover that a little bit more today. And then we talked just a little bit briefly about elders and deacons and some of their responsibilities, and looked at a couple of verses there, which again, last week was kind of an introduction, and we'll come back to some of those and go into more detail on those. I've also listed there on your handout there the source from majority of the stuff we're going to talk about today, and some of the stuff that I mentioned last week is a good book there. It's geared, I guess, more toward elders and deacons and church leadership specifically, but it lists some of this other stuff that even if we're not necessarily serving as in one of those specific roles, it's still a good book to read. It's more geared toward a smaller class setting, so I'm not going into a lot of the details that are in the book. So if you want more info on anything we're talking about today, I definitely encourage you to find that Assessing 21st Century Christian Leadership and study it a little more detail on your own. I tried finding the book recently, and it was on back order, so it's an older book, so it might be a little bit harder to find, so it may take you a little bit of searching around on the internet to find it. So today we're going to, as I mentioned last week, we're going to look at leadership styles. And again, some of this stuff we're going to go through, and the stuff that's on your page there, if you find 10 books, you may find 10 different ways to break this down. And he uses some words I'd never even heard of in some of his, I guess, descriptions and categorizing this. So I don't want you to focus too much on that. I gave you this just so that you can refer back to it, because we're going to look at some other stuff as well as we're going through this. And it's mainly just to help us organize our thoughts when we get into this. But when you talk about leadership styles, the author of the book, he gave one basic way to look at leadership styles is either positive or negative. Talking more about motivation. So one way to look at that is when you think about, and when first thing come to mind when I was reading through this was, as a parent, how do we, lead our children? And when you're talking about that, does your kind of natural setting go to a positive reinforcement For example, you want your kid to clean their room. Do you approach it as, all right, if you go clean your room, then we'll go get ice cream afterwards when you're done? You offer kind of a reward, a motivation. The flip side of that would be a negative connotation. Negative approach would be, all right, if you don't get in there and clean your room, I'm taking your cell phone away for a week. So it's more of a punishment versus reward sort of style. And again, we won't go into that too much because some of that may lean toward how often have you had to tell your kid to clean your room. You may go from a reward, aspect to a punishment aspect depending on what the situation is. But what we want to look at today is more what's on your page there. And again, we're going to go through these and then we'll look at it a little more. And I apologize, maybe by the time I get through this class, I'll have these slides to where you can actually see them. But the font may be a little too small, so I'll keep on increasing it till y'all tell me you can see it. But again, most of this stuff is on the page in front of you, which is another reason for giving you this. So the first style that Mr. Reilly, I guess is how you pronounce his name, suggests is what he calls autocratic. Again, you could find different words to describe this, but again, it's something, a bullet point for us to talk about. And what you have with an autocratic style is these type leaders participate in most of the decision-making process. It's more of the leaders tell the people what's the decision has been made. And of course we're talking about mainly church leadership, so you're talking about your leaders would make the decision and then just kind of tell the congregation, this is what we've decided, this is what we're doing. Doesn't really involve the congregation in the decision-making process at all. More of I guess, if you move that into the secular world, more of a boss type role that you would have in a company. We're going to go through these, and again, we're going to look at some other stuff, but if you have any comments, feel free to speak up. The next one, and again, these are kind of varying degrees of I don't know if authority is the right word, but just slight changes. The next one's a benevolent autocrat, which it uses the same word, so it's slightly similar to the first one we talked about. But in this one, the leaders seek ideas, but ultimately they still control the decision. So they may reach out to some people to get some ideas on the decision they're making, but then ultimately they still are the main decision makers. And they do it more of I guess you could say, more lovingly way. They kind of try to sell the congregation or the people on their decision to maybe convince them why. They still make the decision, but they're saying, all right, here's why we made this decision. You can kind of see it kind of involves the congregation a little bit more. The third one is what he calls participative style of leadership. And this is where before the leadership ever makes a decision, they seek out, opinions, thoughts, ideas on things, more of a may consult some people on, hey, here's a decision we've got to make. Give us your ideas. Again, still ultimately the decision falls on the leadership to decide what the best route is, but they take input before making that decision. The next one, which is one we're in our country kind of familiar, at least with the word democratic, although we won't get into that, but it implies one person, one vote. So if you're talking about from a congregational standpoint, this would be, say the elders are trying to decide on, what color to paint these walls. They put a sheet out there and say, all right, everybody vote. The elders get a vote too. Everybody's opinion is equal. So everybody gets a vote, everybody gets a say. Elders hold no real authority over the decision in that standpoint, but they don't really have any more influence on the decision than anyone else. Then the last one is what he calls free reign, and this is where, you might argue there's no such thing as a leader in this situation, but it's just basically, we'll go back to painting the walls. The walls need painting, so the elders say, all right, we need the walls painted. Let me know what y'all come up with. Hopefully it's done by next Sunday, and then they walk away. There's no leadership role whatsoever in that decision-making process. Of course, painting the walls is kind of a superficial example. You can start thinking about other situations where that could be a worse effect. So of these, so again, you've got them in front of you so you can see them all at one time. I split them up on the screen thinking maybe you could read it better, but it looks like I still need to increase the font or I need to go to the eye doctor because I can't see it real well from this close. So in a church setting, what do you think of these styles, which would you think would fit best for a healthy congregation, a healthy church? Or is there one that fits best? Right, that's a good point, and that's true. It could depend on the situation, and I think you'll find in reality there's times when leadership may drift toward one style depending on what the situation is versus another. So that's a good point. Could depend on the situation.
I was going to say, kind of along what Beverly was saying, I think kind of a combination of the benevolent autocratic and the participative. Because in the benevolent autocratic, sometimes the elders may have information we don't know. And so
Right.
they may need to make a decision
Yeah.
in that
Yeah.
way.
Yeah, you may have some private, things that they can't get up and say, hey, here's what's going on. So that's a good point. It definitely might depend. Mr. Jim?
One of the things you'll see other than probably the last one, is a lot of those involved. But one thing we need to always remember is there is no democratic as far as
Right.
God is concerned.
Yeah.
We don't make that decision. There's no vote ever.
Right.
The leadership styles where you come out here can be the color of all sides of the building.
Yeah.
It don't matter, but anything that's scriptural, there is no democratic vote ever.
Right. And that's where we're going to get a little bit into, I guess, more. You bring up several things. One, the church is a little bit different from secular because there are certain responsibilities that later on we're going to, in weeks to come, get into those responsibilities that fall on the elders to ensure of. And so that comes into play. And we'll get into two personalities of the leaders sometimes leads you to more naturally fall into a certain category, just depending on your personality, your makeup, whether you're an extrovert, introvert, whether you've got some OCD, I guess that's the right acronym, tendencies. I mean, it's a lot of stuff comes into play, which is, kind of why we're talking about it, so we're kind of aware of all those things.
Well, what I was thinking was, when you said you'd ask the child to clean the room, I'll give you ice cream. You tell the child they don't clean the room, they don't get to use their cell phone. The child cleaning the room is a duty.
Right.
It is not one way or the other. It is their duty to
Right.
clean the room. So I don't think that comes in play as far as that's concerned.
Yeah, you're right, yeah. So again, it depends on the situation. And I think Mr. Jim already said it, are there some of these five that would not fit in any situation, most likely? Right. Yeah. Now, the Democratic, you might, the elders may decide to use that process when it comes to painting the rooms, but even then, ultimately, if the vote came back, everybody wanted to paint this room hot pink, I think probably the elders in their wisdom would decide, maybe that's not the best thing. So even that, you're not solely, by his definition, fully Democratic, which, again, as I implied, even our country, we call ourselves a democratic country, but if you go by solely his definition, one vote, one person, one vote, I mean, I think we all know that's not fully true, depending on your opinion there. And again, the free reign, probably definitely not one, because it's just kind of anything goes. So keep all that in mind. We're going to discuss on this more. We're going to look at something else that I think is going to help us kind of pull all this together and maybe see it in a little bit different light. Before we do that, what about the concept of time? How does that, maybe if we're talking about picking a certain type of leadership, does the concept of time come into play there any? If you've got a decision that needs to be made in a hurry, would it be a little bit harder to maybe use some of these other styles?
Well, let's just drop back on the last year. We had that pandemic that hit. We were given directives from the government on what we could and could not do. The elders didn't have time to run through a democratic process.
Right.
That wasn't even in the plan.
Yeah.
As far as a benevolent autocratic, they couldn't sell the decision.
Right.
They were given the
Yeah.
decision. They had to make the wisest decision based on that directive to where we could stay within the scriptural bounds of what had to be done.
Yep. Yep. Sometimes the time that we have to make a decision might, sometimes it might be necessary to use a certain style, but we also may feel, I'm going to show you something that maybe this will make sense. I don't know if you can see that or not. Hopefully this doesn't feel too much like a math engineering class, because we got some charts we're going to look at this morning just to kind of help make a point. This is just something to think about when we're thinking about choosing, if we're in a leadership role, we're thinking about choosing a style of leadership. I think, again, I would agree that there are times when time is of an essence and a decision has to be made. You don't have time to maybe inform everyone, get input, then go back and discuss. It takes some time. But sometimes I think maybe we use that as an excuse. Sometimes maybe it's easier for us to just make a decision and move on instead of taking the time to get everyone involved. If you look at this chart up here, this just kind of illustrates a little bit better. On the top, you've got your autocratic leadership style, kind of the one we said where it's just, no input from the people or the congregation. The leadership just makes all the decision and then says, all right, here's what we're doing. So kind of the extreme, right? Then the bottom one is your participative leadership style. We've all said democratic and free range probably not the way to go anyway, so we're leaving that out. So this is kind of a little bit either ends of not the extreme, but what we would logically say a style that we would probably use. And then your line going to the right with the arrow is time. So how much time it takes from this point here, if you can see it, is kind of when the decision is made. So there's an issue or something, a decision needs to be made. So we would all agree autocratic leadership, you would think, could probably get together and make a decision pretty quick, right? Because you're not taking the time to get input and all that. It's, usually the fewer people you have, the quicker it is to make a decision, right? So your participative leader, he's going to have to, on the front end, he's going to have to take time to inform the congregation. Here's, decision we're making. We want your input. So that's going to take a little more time, right? The thing that I'd never really thought about till I saw this, and this is an illustration straight out of the book that's on your source there, is the actual implementation point, or the time when the change is implemented. You would think if you just make the decision, then you would be able to just implement, right? Do you agree with what he's saying here, that with the participative style, you may in reality actually get the change implemented first? What are some, can you think of some reasons why that might be?
Well, someone may offer a suggestion that they never even considered, and it just.
Well, that's true. You might get a suggestion that the leadership hadn't considered that would be the right way to go. Any other thoughts?
Here in the participative part, that you've already got people involved in what's going on, and once that group comes to a decision, you already have a team ready to move forward what you have. In the autocratic part, for a small group, you make decisions, you're going to have to depend on other people to help implement things. You got to explain it, you got to sell it, you got to help them understand why it happened, and then you got to go through all of that, which is the participative part that's already occurred.
Right, yep. Johnny kind of hit the nail on the head, so I'll repeat it for those that didn't hear. We talked about last week about, how we're all a congregation. It's all our duty to do the Lord's work, and, the elders have the authority and the overseeing, which we're going to look at that verse again here in just a little bit. But in reality, they can't do all the work, right? We all have a responsibility and a duty to help perform the work. So as Johnny pointed out, in this style here where you take the time on the front end to get input before making, and again, in this style, the elders still have the authority and the responsibility to ultimately either make the decision or we'll see, make sure the decision that's made is best they can decide is the right decision. But you've already informed the congregation of what's going on. They already understand what's going on. They've given input. So when the decision's finally made, they already kind of know, or at least have, on the same page, so to speak. So once the decision is made and they're informed, all right, here's how we're going to do it. As Johnny said, they're already engaged and ready to move forward with the work. Whereas with the first style, they're kind of, in a lot of cases, caught, off guard, kind of blindsided, maybe didn't even know anything was going on. And then now they've got to grasp what's going on, and so that they can do whatever it is you're making a decision about.
Like in that autocratic, it also depends on the type situation. Like, Alan and I went to one congregation where during a class time period, the gentleman started speaking of unscriptural things.
Right.
He had always been on this path, but there he had a platform, so they
Right.
immediately made the decision to remove him and separate him from the congregation that day. But yet, that was one action they took. But then they had to have a discussion and pray and everything on what to actually do with this gentleman for the congregation.
Right.
Were they going to disfellowship him or what? So yeah, it took, they had to make a decision quickly, but then they had to pray on it to make the ultimate
Right, it was
decision.
a bigger process in the end. Yeah, and I think, again, this is in a general sense. This is not all inclusive, and there's always going to be exceptions, right? Again, going back to the elders and their responsibility, that there's times where they can't necessarily follow this, participative leadership style given the situation. So I'm not saying they should do this with every single decision they make. Main point in this, and again, we're going to look at this at a different angle that may help, is that, there's some advantages when you can of doing this, and maybe we should put more effort in trying to go that direction sometimes, even when we think we're in a hurry necessarily, and necessarily being in a hurry may not, you may still get there quicker in the end with the participative, if that's making sense. Mr. Jim?
One thing we think, elders are not perfect people.
Right,
We're all human. We all do we are. But one thing you always think about, if they're elders leading like they should know the congregation, there are decisions sometimes that they should know that it would be easier to decide whatever that might be, and it may not be necessary to scripture, but the scripture, we don't have any choice. That's
Right.
the decision of the elders, really.
right.
But, but keep less controversy, keep flowing, what a sheep needs to eat, the sheep may want to eat worse thing more. The elders have to provide what food is proper.
Right.
Based on that. So, it's a combination, it can't be in one thing down on everything, it's so many different variables involved and decisions that make, it doesn't fit like business world at all.
Yeah, well, usually business, and with business world, you're in a certain niche of the industry, so, I guess that's why a lot of people change jobs a lot of times. Once you've been there 5-6 years, to some degree, you've seen it all, so it's the same stuff that comes up over and over again. Like you said, there's all kind of things involved with the congregation that sometimes we're not even aware of or don't even think about.
You see this too, between the two, there's gonna be a temptation there. And you see it in government, you see it in business, I'm sure it's the same religiously as well. If you get used to making the autocratic
Right.
It takes longer, you have to consider other options, that kind of thing. You used to do it the autocratic way, and I'm just making this, here we go. It gets easier for the group that's doing that, and there's a temptation to fall back to that as opposed to going forward with participating
Right.
from the start.
Yeah, participative takes more conscious effort, I guess. Um, and like you said, sometimes we can, and sometimes it's our personalities. We may fall more into, for lack of a better word, that rut of just, it's just simpler. Let's make this decision and move on. And like you said, it takes more effort to involve more people a lot of times. And again, we're going to talk more about that here on our next slides. Mr. Fromm?
Participating has a great deal of risk with it, because there's a good chance that somebody that's participating thinks their suggestion is better than anybody else can
Yeah.
come up with. And when it's not you, they can become angry. So you got, and that's an extreme
Right.
situation. But that's a risk to run.
Yeah, it is a risk, and I guess depending on how you look at it, it's also an opportunity, right? If that person does, because that person probably going to get mad, whatever style you use, if you didn't read their mind and choose the decision they thought was right. So sometimes with the participative, you get ahead of that because it becomes more apparent earlier that person's got an issue. So it's an opportunity for the leaders to go talk to that person and explain why they made the decision that they made.
One thing we know is we don't want to know everything the elders have to deal with.
Well, yeah, you're right there. Yeah, and again, this is more of a general thing. So I know there's situations and things that they did, and it's good. You're right. We don't want to know a lot of that stuff a lot of times, and why is that? Because it's stressful for them probably, but it's good for us to be conscious that there are times like that, and allows us to be more understanding of our leadership, because we know they are under a great deal of pressure, at times. Again, and being an elder, deacon, whatever, a preacher, teaching Bible class, any of us that have done any of that, it can be a rewarding thing, and most of the time there's a lot of rewards to that, but it can be stressful, and just the fact that it's extra time that you take to do that can add some burden there, I guess you could say. We're not going to really change gears a whole lot, but we're going to look at this from a different angle. And before we do that, let's go back to one of the verses we read last week in 1 Peter chapter 5, verses 1 through 4. If you want to turn there, we're going to kind of look at this in a little more detail, at least part of it. So 1 Peter 5, verse 1 through 4. So I exhort the elders among you as a fellow elder, a witness of the sufferings of Christ, as well as a partaker in the glory that is going to be revealed. Shepherd the flock of God that is among you, exercising oversight, not under compulsion, but willingly, as God would have you, not for shameful gain, but eagerly, not domineering over those in your charge, but being examples to the flock. And when the chief shepherd appears, you will receive the unfading crown of glory. Likewise, you who are younger, be subject to the elders. Clothe yourselves, all of you, with humility toward one another, for God opposes the proud, but gives grace to the humble. So when we think about these different styles of leadership, and we look at that verse where it talks about shepherding the flock, overseeing, but not domineering, or some of your translations probably say lording over. And if we go back to the verse in Matthew that we read last week, I believe that was chapter 20, 25, where he's not talking specifically to elders there, but he's talking to the apostles about, the Gentiles lording over them, and it's not to be that way with them, but they're to be servants. So how do we mesh those, say, duties of an elder to be a shepherd and overseer? Can an elder truly oversee without any authority? if you go the free reign route, can they oversee and shepherd without having some authority? So there's got to be some authority, right? So how do you have authority without lording over a congregation, or domineering, as my translation says? You got to do both, right? So how do we do that? I guess is what I'm saying. I'm hoping this will help a little bit. So you got this chart here, and you probably can't see it real well, but this comes from, and this is nothing new. I think I was talking to somebody last week, you know, when you talk about issues in the church or challenges with leaders and how you should lead, this has been a topic for a long time. So this is Roy Nance, who, I'm trying to think, I think he was an engineering manager for some big firm, who was also served as an elder. So that may explain why we got charts. But he wrote an article in the Gospel Advocate in 1982 called Styles of Church Leadership. And this is going to be similar to the stuff we just went over, but it again, he goes at it from a slightly different angle that, you know, it kind of clicked a little more with me. But in this chart, you've got on the bottom, this is your concern for production. So when you're talking about a leadership, and I believe he adapted this from a secular leadership article or training and adapted it more for spiritual stuff. But as you go from 1 to 9, 9 being you're most concerned about being productive or getting the job done, I guess you could say, and 1 being your least concerned. On the left, going up and down here, this is your concern for the feelings of the members. So this is how concerned the leaders are for the feelings of the congregation. So I think we both agree that those are two important things, right? Being productive, and part of being productive is doing the right thing, right? And, you know, we've already said that ultimately elders are responsible for making sure the right things are done, and we do things right, and we don't, you know, especially we don't do things wrong. So the higher you go, the more concerned you are for the feelings of the members. So you're going to fall somewhere as a leader or as a congregation. We're going to fall somewhere on this chart. So just going through a couple of these, if you fall 1 and 1, this is similar to the free reign. You know, you really don't have a whole lot of concern for being productive, and you don't really have a whole lot of concern for the feelings of the members, and probably shouldn't even be a leader for that matter. So you just you don't really care either way, right? So we won't spend a whole lot of time on talking about that. But here's one danger that he suggests could fall from being a congregation that has that style of leadership, is you end up with a domineering preacher who comes in because he's trained in college. They end up falling in ultimately the leadership role. They make most of the decisions, and the eldership just sits back and lets things go, right? So that, I mean, I think we can all agree that's not where we want to be. The next is 1-9, which is going to be, again, not very much concern for production, but they're all about the feelings of the congregation. They want to be liked, want to make sure they don't hurt anybody's feelings. You know, what everybody wants to do, if they want to paint these walls pink, then, well, let's paint them pink, you know, because that's going to make everybody happy. Again, is that a good place to be from a leadership standpoint? That verse did say elders are supposed to lead by example, right? Right, not to be flippant, and if that's all you do is go about leading by example, you know, what if nobody's paying attention to your example? As a Christian, sometimes we use that as an excuse and an easy way out when we talk about going out in the world. We just go and say, well, I don't do bad things. I'm doing what I'm supposed to be doing. I'm being a good example. But if you never actually tell someone why you're being that example, are they ever going to learn about, you know, Christ? So again, this is one of the dangers that he mentions here. If you fall in this style of leadership, these type leaders are even willing to sometimes compromise, going back to what Mr. Jim was talking about, compromising what the scripture even says and twisting it a little bit if that's going to keep everyone happy. So again, I think we all agree that's not where we want to be. The next one's your middle of the road, which you might would think, well, normally middle of the road is good, right? You kind of stay in the middle. Well, I guess it's probably better than these others, but still, and it's probably where a lot of congregations fall when you talk about this style of leadership. But here's some things to think about that this author mentioned about this style of leadership. You have the tendency to make many of the decisions for the congregation, sometimes too many. There can be a failure to properly delegate decisions making to more experienced, mature Christians, and they tend to be more traditionalist, in his opinion, and they can be resistant to new methods. Still not saying unscriptural methods, but just new methods of doing things as times change. And again, it can limit the talent of the congregation, which we'll talk more about that. So here's the other one. This is 9:1. So you care all about production, but still not much concern for the feelings. This is where you fall into I think the extreme. And if you get this article and read it, and it's actually in the book that I referenced there, he puts the whole article in that book. So if you get that book, you get the article too. It's a real good read, and it's an easy read. But one of his reasons for putting this up here is, and again, this was back in 1982, but you could probably see this, even today in some places. But you have tendencies for congregations, and we do that with a lot of things. You swing one end of the pendulum to the other. You so avoid the lording over the flock. You don't want to be that way, so you swing all the way over to the other end. And this would be swinging toward the other end, to where you're, again, the whole lording over the flock. You have no concern for the feelings. You don't, more of a dictator in your decisions, and there's a lack of trust there for other members to be involved. Your danger here is it hurts your development and kind of developing the next generation, and can also create some frustration among your congregation because they're feel out of the loop, so to speak.
Should, when there's some dissension about what the elder's doing, should the elder be able to go to the scriptures and back up what he's doing?
I would say
Can he always do that?
I would say if it's a scriptural issue, all of us should always be able to go to the scripture to back up our decision.
We're still gonna get dissension on some decisions.
Right, there he is.
I don't know that you can always, hopefully you can always go to scripture and transfer that dissension to the
Right. Yeah, you're right. I don't know if I got the answers for you on that, but I think all of the stuff we talk about kind of comes into play there. But yeah, there's always a chance that you're going to have the dissension, no matter, even if the elders do things look at Christ. There's a lot of people who didn't like the decisions or the suggestions or the things he said. But again, that's where, when we get into the qualifications of elders and the duties of elders, it's, it's being strong in the scriptures. And I think that's where, one of the reasons we're having this class is we've got to be sure that as members, we're studying the scriptures just as hard as the elders, so that somewhere in here is our next generation of elders if this church is going to continue to grow. So, but then again, there's going to be some decisions that aren't scripturally based that, it'd be hard to go back to the scripture and base up like the painting, but I think that's where it kind of all comes together on your approach and your sincerity and that sort of thing. And again, like any relationship, it's not a one-sided deal. As a congregation, we've got to be aware of that, and we've got to do our part to behave as Christians as well. when it comes to that kind of stuff.
Part of that is gonna be the growing the maturity of the congregation.
Yep.
Because if color of paint is a problem, that's not the problem. The maturity
Right.
problem with the congregation.
Yep.
There are congregations all over this world, and some of the folks in this room have been there, they don't have walls.
Right. Yeah.
So,
Yep.
if you're worried about, if that is your hang-up on whether or not you come to church, then paint is not a problem.
Right. And
That's gonna fall to the duty of the elders shepherding the flock. Part of the shepherding part is helping to grow spiritually and mature wise, so that
yeah.
that's not.
Yeah,
the problem.
you're right. It's ultimately it's the elders' authority and making sure that necessarily, and some stuff not necessarily making the decision, making sure the decision's made and done right. But then again, you go back again, it's a big job for the elders because they've also got to address the maturity level too. So it comes at them from both sides sometimes. Mr. Jim?
You know, and I think you and I had this discussion just a little bit after last week. And one of the things, whether it's an elder, whether it's in the workplace, if you are a leader, if you're really leading, you're not in that bottom category that we talked about.
Right.
If you're pleasing 100% of the people all the time, you better check yourself out. Something's
Right.
wrong. 'Cause I mean, right here in this room, if we were to say, vote on the color, you pick it out.
Yeah, you're not going to please everybody.
Everybody votes the same way. So, you know,
And-
we're all human, so we gotta remember that as we go through.
And where it gets really touchy, we're talking about walls, but where it gets really touchy is there's going to be some scriptural decisions that not everybody's going to agree with, and some of that's going to be because of their maturity and their knowledge of the scripture. So again, you can't fall in this category here because then, to me, that's the type of elder that's going to say, well, I don't care if you like the decision or not. This is scriptural, and in their mind, and they could be 100% right. They're making the right scriptural decision. But I think as an elder, and when you come to shepherding the flock and feeding the flock, they've still got to deal with that one person that doesn't agree with them. Now, they may never convince them that what they're thinking is wrong and that the right decision is made, but I think they still, as elders, have an obligation to try to shepherd that person and explain to them, why that decision has been made. In most cases, there's always exceptions. Again, when you get into all the things elders are responsible for, there's some things that fall outside this. But let's go to and we're about out of time, this last one, and we may come back and close the loop on this next week. But this last one is again, it ties into the sheet you got there with the other authors' ideas on styles. This is a participative leadership where he's got 9s on both axes. He cares about the production, but he also has concerns for the feelings of the congregation. So this is a type of leadership that, to the best of their abilities, and again, elders, deacons aren't perfect. We're all humans, so we may fall short for various reasons. It may be because their job at work's gotten so busy this week that it was a decision that had to be made, and they had to make it and didn't have time to inform everybody. And it can be all kind of reasons, but to the best of their ability, they try to keep the congregation informed as much as possible on things that they can inform the congregation about. Again, not saying they should get up and go tell, everybody's problems in the congregation, because again, part of the shepherding is helping people in the congregation. So there's going to be some confidential matters that they can't tell everybody about. But when it comes to, in general, the average things, they try their best to keep the congregation informed. One example being last week where Jim and Bubba got up and kind of gave us some update on where we're at on a replacement for Chase and the direction we're going there. Again, communication and informing. And also on this is going to be your style that as much as they can, they're going to involve the congregation in the decision-making process. Again, elders have responsibility for the decisions made, but there are times when they can allow certain people to give some authority to go and make those decisions, and that's, to me, where the overseeing comes in. They're still involved and aware and overseeing the decision, but they turn loose of some of the control and allow, maybe the deacons or whoever's putting together the education program to make some of the decisions. But again, it's ultimately their responsibility, to the best of their abilities, to make sure whatever decisions are being made are correct according to Scripture. And again, they're willing to consider and implement new ideas as long as they're scriptural and programs. I think you'll see that here. Our elders are, the educational program we're doing right now is not something we were doing 20 years ago. So there's some open-mindedness there. And again, this style leadership is willing to at least try to explain some of the decisions that are being made as best they can, so that you kind of get the mesh of some of those other styles where they somewhat try to sell the decision, even though ultimately it's their responsibility to make it.
Congregation can't overlook the fact that the elders realize that they're gonna be judged more severely than the rest of them.
Right.
And that's an awesome responsibility.
Did my mic turn on? I'm about done anyway, so we'll have to place the batteries before Michael needs it. Yeah, so I mean, as Mr. Frome mentioned, it's, again, as a congregation, we have to be aware that, elders are going to be held responsible ultimately more so than we will for those decisions. It is, again, going back to this, it is about leadership, but it's about us as a congregation of everyone understanding what everybody's role is and being more considerate and compassionate and having empathy. Elders are to have empathy toward us and understanding toward us, but, it goes both ways. We have to understand the great deal of responsibility and stress they have, that sometimes we just have to, be submissive to their authority, and it makes their lives a whole lot easier. So I present all that mainly today, and again, we can come back to this some next week, that in reality, this is a chart. You can fit everybody into the box, right? But in reality, we may not be a 9-9 on our leadership, because probably no one's perfect, but we may be a 8-8 or 7-8 or 9-7. We may be somewhere in between here. And we may bounce around. There may be times where we, hopefully we don't ever come all the way over here, but, we move around. So my main reason for presenting this information is that being aware of how our leadership styles affect people and the ultimate goals and our path, and being aware that, we could be somewhere on this chart. It helps us kind of self-reflect and think about when things are coming up, maybe what's the best approach for that situation. And as we've already said, there may be certain times where, depending on the situation, we have to move from one spot to somewhere else. But just being aware of that, and being aware that if the approach we're taking seems to be meeting a lot of resistance and it's not going real well, maybe we need to stop back and analyze our approach and see, well, maybe can I come at this from a different direction. So I think we're out of time. We'll kind of review a little bit next week, and if you got more comments, jot them down, and we can bring them up and discuss them. And hopefully this is going to build when we get into some more of the specific stuff about qualifications and duties of the elders, that we can kind of reference back to some of these leadership styles. And again, I encourage you to get the book. In these chapters, there's stuff we didn't even look at, but there's actually surveys in this book where you can answer all these questions, and then it tells you how to, score yourself, so that if you're in a leadership role or think you may ever want to be a leader, it kind of helps you see naturally, based on how you answer these questions, where do you tend to fall in your leadership style, so that you kind of know, again, goes back to the self-reflecting thing, you kind of know yourself and where you tend to fall. And if you know where you're at, then it kind of can help you adjust and be conscious of your tendencies, to where if you need to, do some things a little bit different, you can intentionally work on those improvements. So again, it's a real good book, and a lot of information we don't get to cover. But thank you for your comments, and we'll kind of pick up there next week and move more into some other stuff besides these charts.